Okay, so hi and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at this press briefing by our speaker. This is Ms. Mariana Katzarova, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Russian Federation. The Special Rapporteur, who is an independent expert for the United Nations, is in New York for the presentation of her new report to the UN General Assembly's Third Committee. The annual Third Committee addresses issues of social development as well as human rights. We will begin with a few remarks from the expert and then open up for questions. Ms. Katzarova, you have the floor. Thank you.
Yes, 1 second. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, members of the press, thank you so much for attending this press conference. I always come with really fear in my heart that there will be an empty room in New York. Unlike Geneva, we have your media colleagues in Geneva really filling the rooms, but I know how many demanding news my colleagues today my colleague on Palestine is speaking, the COI on Palestine. So I know that we're competing for world attention, but you know, I'm really glad you came, because when the Russian people are watching back, or any other people, they see the empty room, and that's disheartening, because they feel like the media of the world, the attention has abandoned them. And I know it's not like that. So hopefully we have people online as well, your colleagues, and thank you really for transmitting the message from the UN, from my mandate to the world, but to the Russian people as well. This is very important. Your role is really crucial to get the word out on human rights. And as you know, it's not a topic that makes the news in the last decades, but now it's worse. I'm a former journalist. I'm class of '92 of Columbia Journalism School, so I feel I could sit on the other side as well. We're here today because I presented yesterday to the Third Committee of the General Assembly my second thematic report and my second report for this year on the situation of human rights in the Russian Federation. I presented my first report mandated by the Human Rights Council resolution last month, and this is my cycle of reporting. It's at the end of September. And end of October in Geneva, and end of October I present my thematic report to the Third Committee of the General Assembly. The topic of this report is rule of fear in Russia, and this is kind of the topic, the theme rather, a strategy to silence anti-war dissent in the Russian Federation, while instrumentalizing, abusing the national security legislation and public safety legislation for the purpose of silencing dissent and silencing civil society or any opposition of the Russian government's strategy of aggression, strategy of war against Ukraine, which is continuing in its fourth year. So, the conclusions of my report, this one, but also the report in Geneva a month ago, is that Russia is now run through a state-sponsored system of fear and punishment, where dissent is erased and civic space dismantled. Along with a whole bundle of laws that the Russian government and Russian authorities have introduced since the beginning of the full-scale invasion against Ukraine in 2022, such as foreign agent legislation or undesirable organizations designations, or the whole bundle of war censorship laws, like discrediting of the Russian army or spreading fake news about the Russian army. Next to these laws, which have been introduced in the Russian criminal code, administrative code, now the Russian authorities, the most fashionable tool, if you wish, for repression has become the abuse of the national security legislation. This is all from treason, espionage, confidential cooperation with a foreign organization or foreign state, and the whole bundle of public safety legislation which relates to counter-terrorism and counter-extremism. Now, these are laws that so many countries around the world have, and they're really supposed to be used for our protection and for going after the real terrorists. Here, though, these laws are instrumentalized to go after the journalists, the human rights defenders, the indigenous people, the members of the LGBT persons, members of the LGBT community, migrants in Russia, and I'm probably missing somebody, the media, in order to basically instill fear in the rest of the population and increase the political prisoners count. Some people are asking me often, actually the Ukrainian government was asking me as well, but you're talking about close to 2,000 political prisoners in Russia, and it's a country of 149 million. This is not a lot. Does that mean that the Russian people accept the war, that they're supporting the war? And I always answer, this strategy of the government really works by example. So people from different professions, different walks of life, just simply for posting or reposting messages on social media against the war have been penalized at first with administrative offenses, then with criminal offenses, imprisoned for their opposition against the war. And this works as a preventive mechanism for other people really to be afraid to show their true sentiments. Also in an authoritarian state, it's very difficult to have any sociology, because when you're stopping people on the street and asking them, do you support the special military operation, nobody really in their right mind would say, no, I don't support it, because this carries imprisonment, this carries lengthy sentences. Now, with the national security and public safety legislation being abused and used as a tool of repression, the Russian authorities are achieving also a very lengthy prison sentences. For example, as you know, thousands of Ukrainian civilian detainees, we don't know the exact count because the Russian authorities are not revealing it, are lavishing in Russian detention, virtually disappeared, most of them, or for those that we know where they are, they're incommunicado detention. They don't have access to their families, to the outside world. One of your colleagues, as you probably know, Victoria Roshina, Ukrainian journalist who was on reporting assignment on the occupied territories of Ukraine. She's from there. She was from Zaporizhia region. Was arbitrarily detained, virtually kidnapped, deported to the Russian Federation, and for, I believe, up to 2 years, she was 1.5, 2 years, she was lavishing in Russian detention, not being charged with anything. Her parents didn't know where she was. And the letters to the parents were answered first. One letter arrived by the Ministry of Defense saying, oh yes, she's in our detention, but no whereabouts or state of health or state of well-being. And the second letter that arrived after tens of letters by the family through the lawyer was, oh, whoops, your daughter actually died 3 weeks ago in detention in Russia. No, again, whereabouts. It took 6 months to return the body, which was agonizing for the family. And I think the whole family was subjected to cruel and inhuman treatment. It could be categorized as psychological torture, of course. In the end, the body was returned this February in a body bag named unidentified male. And then when the Ukrainian authorities started doing forensic examination, there was body parts missing of this body. But they concluded she has been subjected to torture before dying in Russian detention. And Russia is the third in the world biggest jailer of journalists, with 29, probably 28, because one actually was released recently, Vladislav Yasipenko, who was here with us yesterday at the presentation of my report. He spent 4 years, he's a journalist from Crimea Realities, offspring of Radio Free Europe. He spent 4 years in Russian detention, being tortured to secure confession on charges, several different charges, including on espionage. But with 29 or 28 Ukrainian journalists in detention, plus the whole number of journalists in detention with the Russians is around 50. Russia is third in the world. Most of these Ukrainian journalists are not even charged with anything, like Victoria Roshina. Now, the human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, I forgot about the lawyers, and political opponents are systematically prosecuted, many of them tortured and silenced. Anti-war dissenters and activists are serving years in prison, not for crimes, but for courage, to report about the war or to express their dissent. Political prisoners face not only lengthy imprisonment, but also denial of medical care in detention, and particularly being placed in solitary confinement. For psychiatric treatment is also used in Russia, like in the old Soviet times. So punitive psychiatry has returned as a tool against anti-war voices. 51 people forcibly subjected to psychiatric measures for their activism since 2022. This is what my mandate, my team, and I were able to establish. Journalists, again, like Maria Ponomarenko, one of your colleagues, was ordered to undergo compulsory psychiatric treatment for maintaining her anti-war stance in prison. And most recently, I think it was a couple of months ago, she was trying to commit suicide 3 times in 1 week. She's kept in a prison colony far away from her home, and she have been continuing to express her anti-war views, and for this she's been receiving harsh punishments. Now, the counter-terrorism and extremism, which is the topic of the current report at the General Assembly, laws are really used to punish speech, not danger. Former municipal deputy Alexei Gorinov sentence for justifying terrorism was upheld in 2025 for condemning the killing of Ukrainian children. This was a very brave Moscow municipal deputy who said openly at a meeting of the council when the proposal came that they should have a happy exhibition of children's paintings for 1st of June, he said, this is immoral, we cannot have that when our army is killing Ukrainian children as we speak. For that he receives, I believe, 7.5 years imprisonment for discrediting the Russian army, and then later, while in prison, also justifying terrorism, additional 5 years. Novelist, prominent writer Boris Akunin was sentenced in absentia recently to 14 years, again for justifying terrorism, and his real crime was dissenting against the war against Ukraine. 4 days ago, the authorities decided to open yet another case against Boris Akunin on charges of violating the foreign agent laws, the provisions of the foreign agent laws, where he is required, like every designated foreign agent, to write anything that he writes publicly. He has to indicate that he is a foreign agent, or this is written by a foreign agent. For that, another criminal case is open against him. Lawyers defending opposition figures are themselves prosecuted and imprisoned. 3 of Navalny's lawyers were sentenced on extremism-related charges in January 2025. And currently, an elderly, I would say, she's close to 70, 68, I believe, and quite ill, a lawyer in Kaliningrad, Maria Bonsler, She was detained. She was charged of confidential cooperation with a foreign state without the state being mentioned, but it's understood it's Ukraine. She's facing up to 8 years in prison simply for defending politically targeted clients. Now, the latest, of course, has been, again, just before the release of this report, on 14th of October, the Federal Security Service of Russia announced that it was opening a terrorism case against 22 members of the exiled Russian anti-war committee. And these are the leaders of the Russian opposition in exile, starting with Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was released in the prisoner swap last August. He was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment on treason charges for writing 5 articles. It was 3 articles and 2 speeches against the war against Ukraine. And it was a miracle, really, that 8 member states got together and managed to release a number of political prisoners last year. He is a member of this committee. Now they're announcing an opening of a terrorism case against these individuals. Also, this illustrates the determination of the Russian government to extend repression beyond national borders. The same with the provisions of the foreign agent law that now are reaching far beyond the Russian borders, because most of the persecuted, those who are not imprisoned at the moment, persecuted human rights defenders, lawyers, intellectuals, cultural figures managed to escape Russia. Nevertheless, they are designated as foreign agents. So that carries additional punishments even when you are outside Russia. Now, on 22nd October, just now, a week ago, the Russian Prosecutor General's office also demanded the Supreme Court to declare the late opposition leader Alexei Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation a terrorist organization. So far, the Anti-Corruption Foundation has been declared extremist organization. That meant a number of journalists that have been connected to Navalny's organization, but also journalists who wrote about the funeral of Navalny or were covering topics close to his organization or his death, have been charged with extremism-related charges because the organization is extremist. These extremism designations has really become almost absurd in Russia. In my report, I look for this absurdity, for this Kafkian situation sometimes, because I would like to bring to the world the real absurdity of what's happening in Russia to the Russian people. So, for example, a couple of years ago, actually, a librarian in the Republic of Yakutia in Russia, which is one of the, I would say, indigenous republics, because there is a lot of indigenous people living there, far away in Siberia. The librarian in Yakutsk, the main city in Yakutia, was actually charged and tried in administrative court for displaying the books of Heinrich Böll, the German Nobel Prize winner for literature. And I remember reading this court transcript where the poor librarian woman had to promise the court that she's going to lock under key the books of Heinrich Böll because she's not going to display them, but please do not continue to punish me. And she promised this to the judge. Now, why that happened is because there is a Heinrich Böll Foundation which was designated as an extremist organization. Therefore, in Yakutia, the authorities decided that the books are also kind of extremist. And he's long gone, the writer. I mean, in this country, it's good to say the books of Susan Sontag has been censored and banned in Russia because she's been, according to the Russian authorities, expressing views or containing texts about the LGBT experiences. And the Supreme Court of Russia announced, not last year, but the year before last, the whole so-called LGBT movement as an extremist organization. So people, not even LGBT, have been persecuted, imprisoned on administrative charges for promoting the symbols of, displaying the symbols of extremist organization, even when they carry, there was a case of a young woman with her boyfriend sitting in a cafe, and she was displaying she had earrings which were frog-shaped, but with this rainbow flag. And you're aware that the rainbow flag is also a peace flag. The difference between LGBT flag, rainbow, is one color. So we don't know what earring she had, but she was immediately reported by a fellow citizen to the police, and they came for her. And that's not all. I mean, especially with the LGBT movement being designated as extremist, we have, in 24 alone, 13 cases were opened, and in 25, publishing houses were raided over LGBT-themed books. And I told you about Susan Sontag, but also it's Olivia Lang, another writer, a prominent writer. And state-sponsored nationalism also fuels discrimination and violence against women, LGBT communities, the indigenous peoples, migrants, and minorities. We already have, with the LGBT community, we have the first deaths in custody, and the repression is kind of intensifying. It's a whole community of people. Then the Russian authorities went last year for another big group of people. These are the indigenous organizations, the national and ethnic minorities organization. So the so-called non-existent separatist movement in Russia were designated, similarly to the LGBT movement, as extremist. And then in November last year, the authorities came up with a list of 172 non-governmental organizations that were pronounced terrorist, included on the list of terrorists and extremists. The majority of them indigenous organizations and national minorities, which, of course, opens up the gates for criminal prosecutions further based on terrorism charges and lengthy prison sentences. Now, you have all the numbers in my report. I hope you have a copy of my report. I'm not going to repeat all of the statistics. I would just say, with the Ukrainian detainees, POWs are not recognized in the Russian Federation as prisoners of war because the Russian authorities do not recognize this as a war, but just as a special military operation. Therefore, the POWs do not enjoy the protections of the Geneva Conventions. At the same time, many of them are kept in detention in Russian prison colonies together with civilian detainees as well, Ukrainian. Some people are charged and then tried. And I want to emphasize the courage and bravery of Russian lawyers, and especially the majority of them Russian women lawyers, not always from privileged Moscow and St. Petersburg places, but from the North Caucasus, from different southern regions of Russia, who bravely are defending the Ukrainian detainees tried mainly in Rostov-on-Don, in military courts, behind closed doors. And the majority of the Ukrainian detainees, both military and civilian, who come up for trials, for sure one of the charges against them is a charge of terrorism. Also, the military battalions of the Ukrainian army, like Azov or Aidar, the POWs from them are not considered, of course, as I said, POWs, so they're not tried as, for their participation in hostilities. under humanitarian law, they are charged on terrorism charges, and these battalions are pronounced terrorist organizations. So the absurdity goes further that he's here with us today for these days in New York. Sergei Davidis, one of the leaders of Memorial, the Nobel Peace Prize winning Russian human rights organization, he runs this project for Memorial on the political prisoners. And he was charged and then tried in absentia on justifying terrorism, only for posting a statement by Memorial recognizing the members of Azov battalion and other military Ukrainian battalions as political prisoners in Russia. For that, he received 6 years imprisonment, thank God, in absentia. So, coupled with, of course, the absolute crackdown of the Russian authorities, this is now intensifying of freedom of the internet. So, for example, there is now a new law on extremism for searching extremist materials on the internet. And I just imagined like some retired person, you know, grandma, grandpa looking for something and finding the report of my colleague, the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, which I'm sure is considered extremist because any LGBT material is considered extremist, or even reading materials of these organizations of indigenous people or national minorities. This is extremist material. And then the authorities will be monitoring who is looking for these extremist materials online. First, it will be administrative charges, but on 2 counts in Russia, with most laws, you get criminal charges afterwards and imprisonment. I have recommendations in the report, as always, there to the Russian authorities. To be honest, because the Russian authorities, of course, are not implementing these recommendations. Every year I have now in my 3rd year of the mandate, I have the dilemma, do I have 10 pages of recommendations? Do I repeat the same recommendations that they haven't fulfilled? Or do I, move on and add new recommendations? It should be in an annex, maybe next year, 50 pages of recommendations. But this is unfortunate. The Russian authorities do not give me access to the country. They actually quite emboldened for some reason this year, on the 3rd year of the mandate, on 8th of September, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs published a statement against the mandate and how they don't recognize it and they're not going to communicate, which is very unfortunate, because why do we have UN human rights mechanisms when the member states are left to choose and pick whether to listen, whether to engage, and everything is in the engagement with member states. I mean, we as human rights experts are independent. We're appointed by peers of member states because they consider the situation in the country urgent. So we're the ones to report dispassionately and in full objectivity. And if you heard the room yesterday, there was a number of member states from Belarus to Iran to Venezuela and others saying things like, oh, because you're not let inside the country, that's why we don't trust your findings, they're based on hearsay. This is, Venezuela said, this is a propaganda pamphlet, your report. And of course, this is not true. I invited all member states, including Venezuela yesterday, to come to me, to engage with my mandate, to point to what is inaccurate in my reports. I would welcome such conversations with any member state of the United Nations, but first and foremost with the Russian Federation. We may not agree, but we need this communication. Otherwise, there is not real impact to move the situation into some positive way forward. I'll stop here and I'll welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Special Rapporteur. Are there any questions in the room? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Nama Abdullah with Rudao Media Network. Just one question. You said you've never been given access to go to Russia, even the first year?
No, the Russian authorities refused to give me access. They simply didn't reply. And also they officially, as I said, on 8th of September, they said they're not recognizing such a mandate in principle, which is going to monitor them. And even the ambassador gave an interview, and I think he said something like, the ambassador in Geneva, to the Russian Russia 24 television channel in the first year. And he said something like, but this is Russia, this is not some kind of, I don't remember which country was named in Africa, but it sounded quite diminishing. We're Russia, we cannot be monitored. Which really, you know, the meaning of my mandate is actually huge, because it's an achievement for the whole of the UN, because in a way it showed that even one of the most powerful P5 member states that are permanent members of the Security Council could be subjected to such a mandate, which was meant, and it's always meant, in the positive. It's meant to engage the government, to go into the country, to sit down with the government, to discuss issues, because we're concerned about the Russian people and their human rights. These are their people. We're not talking about somebody else. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And it's very sad that the Russian authorities have chosen this attitude, because I would be the first to run and go to Russia, and outside Russia to sit with the ambassadors to engage.
Like, do you have researchers inside Russia that can work for the United Nations and help you, like through interviewing people off the record or on the record? Thank you.
We wish. I mean, that would be great. Actually, are you aware that Geneva, the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, is actually laying off people because there's no money to sustain the very bone of the Human Rights Office of the United Nations? No, I don't have for the mandate researchers inside Russia. First of all, look, we live in 21st century, thank God. And I receive a huge volume of information from victims. Anybody could write to my mandate, and I welcome this. I always, my little team of two colleagues from Geneva, from the Office of the High Commissioner, always tell me, oh God, at every interview you're inviting more people, more Russian people to write to you who want to submit to the mandate their worries, their human rights violations. So I receive more information that I can even handle, to be honest. Their lawyers are writing. I'm, seasoned human rights professional and UN former staff member. I was the coordinator of the Belarus mandate of the High Commissioner. Now it's an independent accountability mandate. I try to verify, really, from different sources, the truth about each submission, each allegation that is made, in order to include it in the report. But I interview directly victims when that's safe for them. Obviously, outside the country or even inside the country, Ukrainian former detainees. I mean, for example, I established this year firsthand, because I've been hearing this hearsay about Russian doctors participating in torture. And I thought, let me check what that is. Does it exist? Does it not exist? And me and my little team put tremendous amount of effort to identify these Ukrainian former detainees. And I interviewed one in hospital, yes, online, because it was safe for them. They are back in Ukraine. But this is very important. I received the medical information on the cases to establish really whether their claims were true. And yes, I established the fact that Russian doctors have been participating directly in torture of particularly Ukrainian detainees, or they have been present when the prison authorities have been torturing in front of their eyes, or they have been giving instructions. One of the very popular torture methods in Russia is against everybody, but also Ukrainians, is electric shocks. They apply them to the genitals, sexualized torture, or any other sensitive body part. So the doctors were saying, you should not torture them longer than, 10 minutes, or you should be putting the electrodes here and not there in order for the detainee not to die, to be able to interrogate them. So this is totally unacceptable. One Russian doctor, actually quite sophisticated from Moscow, who was doing a stint in Donetsk on the occupied territories, and I spoke to the victim, was a young guy from a little village next to Kharkiv, which is this border region next to Russia. And he didn't even speak Ukrainian well, because these are the Russian-speaking Ukrainians living by the border with Russia. He was mobilized by Ukraine, by the Ukrainian army. He went to fight to protect his country. He was wounded and taken POW, prisoner of war, by the Russian and pro-Russian Donetsk Republic armed forces, and kept for a day without providing medical help. He was heavily wounded. Then he was operated by this Moscow doctor, who did a great job. He saved his life. He did a great medical job in the surgery. But when the guy woke up, he was like, what's wrong with my stomach? So he looked. This Russian doctor, after finishing the surgery, has burned on his stomach "Glory to Russia" and the letter Z. And the letter Z in Russia is symbolizing, during this war against Ukraine, this pro-war sentiment in Russia. I think this is despicable, really. Why? So, yeah. So I want to say that, yes, I receive, and not just receive, I look for firsthand evidence in order to make a conclusion whether something exists or doesn't exist. It has to be the truth.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Catherine Huggins from Mainichi Newspapers. You spoke about the lack of engagement with Russia and your mandate. So my question is, realistically, what do you think can actually be accomplished if they continue to not engage? And what would you like to see from other member states? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's very important. First of all, it's not just Russia that is not engaging. We are about 13, very small group of special procedures, special rapporteurs, country mandate holders, as opposed to our colleagues who are thematic mandate holders, special rapporteurs. But the country ones are really, we're rare, we're the most sensitive and the most vulnerable, because our mandates are voted by the Human Rights Council member states every year. We don't know, whether the mandate would continue beyond this 1 year. My mandate was just voted in Geneva on 7th of October. So I'm grateful that we have another year to continue working, because the situation is deteriorating. Now, it's very important that the United Nations member states know the situation in Russia on one level. All member states, who are, as you know, in the Human Rights Council, they rotate. So it's not just one regional group, they're all regional groups. And for the first time, through this mandate on Russia in 2023, there was a report in 80 years of the existence of the UN after World War II. For the first time, there was a report on human rights in Russia. So on one level, it's the knowledge of the world and the United Nations governments and member states, what's happening in Russia. This is a very important contribution of this mandate. Secondly, Russia is, one of the leaders of the United Nations. As I said, one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Russia and her colleagues, the other P5, they're deciding, P4, they're deciding on security in the world. They're deciding questions on safety, on security in other conflict zones in the world. So when you have a country like that, violating, first of all, the human rights of their own people. And I maintain that the repression at home is intimately connected to the aggression abroad against the neighboring Ukrainian people. These are the governments that should be leading the way and showing respect for the human rights conventions and the whole instruments of international human rights law, humanitarian law, and United Nations has come up with all these conventions. So giving them recommendations, whether they're following or not, is keeping the high standard of accountability for a government as it should be. Whether it's Russia or another one, but Russia has a double responsibility as a permanent member. So that's very important. And as one human rights defender, we had a special side event yesterday, Rule of Fear, it's called, as opposed to Rule of Law. And there was Russian lawyers, human rights defenders that participated in it. As one of them said, what the Special Rapporteur is doing, what I'm doing with this mandate is a record of repression. I don't know, летопис, как переводим? Летопис. Chronicles of repression. Sorry, I'm Bulgarian, my Russian sometimes let me down. It's a chronicle of repression. It's a chronicle of failure to protect the rights of its own people. And Russia has to be held accountable. To the international community, I always also give recommendations. One of them is really justice inside Russia is unattainable. This is clear because the whole justice system is politicized, because judges are listening to victims of torture and not even opening or ordering investigation into the allegations. The whole system, and then sentencing them to lengthy prison terms. So one of the things that I'm asking the international community is to look into their national provisions in their national legislation and use the framework of universal jurisdiction. I know it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And it needs political will. It also needs resources for their prosecutors, for their justice system to look into this. I really believe that we should put on notice, I work on Russia, but I mean, it applies to all other countries. We should put on notice all of the torturers, the directors of prisons where political prisoners die under mysterious circumstances, where torture continues. We should put on notice the judges who are not paying attention to allegations of torture by the victims and who nevertheless, for political reasons, are giving and using the national security legislation, justifying terrorism, or the whole bundle of laws on the war censorship, discrediting the Russian army and so forth. They should be put on notice. And I never propagate or comment on economic sanctions because, frankly, I think it's a tool of member states. I personally don't necessarily promote this. I haven't seen that it worked in other countries because dictators always stay untouchable, and it's the people, the population that suffers of such economic sanctions. But I'm absolutely all for human rights sanctions, putting on notice by name those who continue to torture, who continue to repress the innocent and to hurt them. In each country, but in Russia to begin with, I work on Russia. So this is, and the third thing I'm asking the international community, I'm very preoccupied with the Ukrainian civilian detainees in Russia, thousands of them, including the children. Look, our humanitarian law provides us with some framework. At the end of this conflict, of this war, there will be for sure all-for-all exchange of prisoners of war. But how about the civilian detainees? And how about the Russian political prisoners who are languishing in prison because they were against the war? So what would happen to them? And I think the international community should look out of the box. The times are demanding it, and come up with an international mechanism which, of course, with the involvement of the International Committee of the Red Cross, who are the custodians of the humanitarian law. However, come up with a mechanism that would demand the beginning of the release or facilitate the release of the civilian detainees, Ukrainians, regardless of the outcome of peace talks, regardless what these peace talks come up and decide in the end. Because otherwise, it's a very worrying situation, and many of them are dying in detention. And trust me, I'm sending constantly to member states, various member states, these lists, and I'm ready to provide them to the Russian authorities. They're in my reports in many ways. Lists of political prisoners and Russian and Ukrainian detainees, civilian, that are really close to death because they're either torture victims or they have been subjected to starvation or they have cancer and other diseases. And I think they should start releasing them, even on humanitarian grounds. These are among some of the recommendations I'm giving. And of course, protection of the human rights defenders from Russia. You know, I absolutely speak to all member states, many of them very supportive of my mandate, but you know, we have a tough talk sometimes with member states, in the European Union included, when human rights defenders from Russia are treated like perpetrators and enemies purely on, you know, some kind of Russophobic sentiments of, you know, of the governments in power and government change. So, for example, several days ago, one member state detained at their border one human rights defender. She had a Schengen visa, but they annulled it, and they sent her back. They deported her, thank God not to Russia, to another country, but to Turkey. But still, this is unacceptable. Russian human rights defenders should be able to open bank accounts, able to operate in exile, which is not happening in many countries. This is what I'm advocating for.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. I apologize for coming late, so if my question has been addressed, you can just skip it. My name is Abdul Hamid. So I am from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. First question, how much access you have into Russia? Do they cooperate? Zero? That I'm sure you addressed that, but you might, yeah. And the second, have you met with Russian speakers who lived in the part of Ukraine that is mostly Russians, and they have been prosecuted by Ukrainians also, and who fled to Russia in Donbass region? And if you can tell us a little bit more. And the one thing you just said, and important, that permanent members supposed to do double the work to protect the human rights. Don't you think that apply all to the 5 permanent members? And we can, I'm sure you know how much these 5 permanent members abuse human rights everywhere they go. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for your newspaper, right, or agency. Thank you, because you're part of the world also ravaged by war. I mean, it's very important that we look at the whole world, isn't it? We are the United Nations without compromising on human rights wherever it happens. And as I said, I thought nobody would come because my colleague, the Special Rapporteur on Palestine, is speaking at the moment. And of course, it's absolutely unacceptable that she's been put on sanctions by the United States. I, of course, spoke up about it in defense. As a matter of principle, we're independent experts. We cannot be sanctioned by any member state, regardless, because we are expressing our opinion as independent experts, and this is freedom of expression. So I think it opens the gates for many member states to copycat the same against independent human rights mechanisms of the UN. This is unacceptable. Secondly, no, I'm not. Unfortunately, the Russian authorities are not giving me access to the country. Every time my mandate is voted, I write to Mr. Lavrov, to the ambassador in Geneva. I ask for this access and I ask for engagement. There's nothing more I can do. I cannot go chase the Russian authorities in the corridors of the UN, right, to ask them to shake hands and engage. But I welcome such engagement. But the Russian authorities have chosen not to engage, as many other member states. Look, nobody likes to be monitored, even by one woman independent expert. We see it in my colleague on Palestine and other colleagues. We're the most sensitive mandates. We're country specific. And in this respect, no, I don't. The continuation of your question, look, I spent before this mandate, I actually spent between 2014, 2016, I was leading the regional office, I opened it in fact in Donetsk, in eastern Ukraine, of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission. I've seen the beginning of this war and this conflict firsthand with my little team. We were informing, of course, the Office of the High Commissioner, but also directly the whole UN system, including the Security Council, of what's happening there. So this was my only time being in the occupied territories. Obviously, I'm not allowed in the country, so therefore I haven't been in the occupied territories of Russia, by Russia, of Ukraine either, since I became a Special Rapporteur. My mandate does not cover Ukraine. And as you know, these are occupied territories. They're not recognized officially by the UN. UN is recognizing Russian borders as they are, without the Donetsk, Lugansk, and the rest of it. But there are other UN mechanisms. There are colleagues of mine, the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, or there are other bodies that should be looking into Ukraine. Now, but of course, I do receive submissions from people on the occupied territories who are, from Crimea or from other countries. They then end up in Russia proper, being tried, because the courts are there. And anyway, even if they're tried on the occupied territories, it's Russian justice system, it's Russian courts, it's Russian institutions. So I do receive such information. And as I mentioned, I have invited here, we had a side event yesterday, Vladislav Yasipenko, who is a journalist from Crimea. He spent 4 years in prison being tortured to confess that he's a spy for, for Ukraine. But actually he was just released from Russian detention in June. And he told despicable things about he was tortured with electric shocks, beaten, to confess that he was a spy. He in the end confessed, and he spent these years in prison. So I do monitor in a way. If you were in the room yesterday, you probably heard I was talking about the case of Natalia Vlasova, which is, I always talk about her because you know how some people, without even having met them, stay with you. Because it's so horrific what happened to them. It's the end of humanity, really. And she was detained on the occupied territories. She was gang raped by 15 armed men, Russian Donetsk Republic armed men. Then she was raped with a bottle. Then she was tortured with electric shocks. And then, if this was not enough, they filed her teeth with a metal file. Beautiful mother of one, civilian woman, and she was so brave to go to the Rostov-on-Don military court, which in a rare occasion opened up for some monitors. So this is how we know what she said in court to the judge. She said she told all this torture, and she said, please, investigate what happened to me. I signed confessions under torture. And the judge not only didn't pay attention, but sentenced her to 18 years and 2 months imprisonment. She is in Russian prisons now. Her child, she can't see it, obviously, but she's my number one on the list, this woman, to be released on humanitarian grounds because she's a torture victim. And because, I mean, one of the charges against her was terrorism. As I said, I mean, most Ukrainians are charged with terrorism offenses. But you know, I mean, when such impunity exists and when we can, you know, torturers are not some kind of horrible monsters. They're people like me and you. How people become so I want to say evil, I'm sorry, but how do people become so cruel to other human beings? And you know, shooting somebody is easy, right? You shoot somebody, then you regret on reflection. But torturing with the metal file a woman in front of you who obviously is crying, yelling, I mean, it's excruciating pain. Can you even imagine? I think about this at least once a week since I heard that. And in my presentation at the General Assembly, I spoke about the Russian case. 2 young boys, 18 years old, twin brothers, accused on charges of terrorism, accused that they were connected to the Russian battalion that is fighting on the Ukrainian side. Whether that's true or not, that they wanted to join it, that they wanted to do some filming of some sabotage on a Russian military base. I mean, how can we believe evidence when they're taken through such brutal torture? So one of these two brothers, Timofey, they're called Melnikov brothers. Timofey had this rare genetic disorder where his genitals are really small, really underdeveloped. And what the Russian authorities did, they undressed this guy, Timofey, and they started torturing him with a hammer, hammering his genitals, threatening him with castration. I don't know why people are living on this. I'm sorry, it's brutal, but people are living exactly on this story. I'm sorry, we have to have the stomach for this, because this is our world too. It's not just roses and orchids. And then they burned his genitals with a torch, and then threatened him to sign a confession of guilt, threatening the death of his father. Timofey did. I received this case through the mother from inside Russia. The brothers are in prison. And the mother said, please, they want the United Nations to know. I have this letter from the mother. The United Nations should know what's happening with the two brothers. And I told the story yesterday. And I'm telling you now. So, yes, I know people from the occupied territories. People write to me from inside Russia. It comes down to impunity and lack of accountability, and everything is allowed, right? This is when torture flourishes, which is absolutely forbidden everywhere in the world by the United Nations Convention Against Torture, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Special Rapporteur. And with that, we thank you for attending, and we'll close this briefing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for writing about this. Really, it's important. Just bring the word, spread the word, in the hope that Timofey, Natalia, they would be vindicated for all the suffering, and there'll be justice. Thank you.